New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare and a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in New York in the 2022 elections. I'm running against the incumbent Senator Chuck Schumer. And tonight we're going to talk about the Green New Deal and Great Reset and our food supply and some of what some people might call the unintended consequences of climate policy. I would call them intended. So first, let me let you know who's going to be joining me this evening. We have Brady, who is the Executive Director of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association. Really glad to have you. We have Bruce Beckwith, a fisherman from Long Island. We have Andy Olson, who is a farmer from the windswept state of Minnesota. And we may be joined by another one of our farm leaders, Bob Baker, later this evening. Also, before I get started, I should just say that the participation of some of my guests on this program, some people represent organizations, et cetera, does not mean that they or their association has endorsed my campaign. And I want people to speak freely, all of us. We're in an age of terrible censorship, so I will just say that the views expressed by my guests don't necessarily reflect my views. And if you want to know if there's some ambiguity, please post your questions or comments in the YouTube chat or Facebook chat, and our moderators and tech team can look at your questions and convey them to us. So that being said, we have just now had 2 days of this so-called climate summit on Earth Day, our new pagan backwards looking holiday, which was set up in 1970, exactly at the point where we had shut down the space program, shut down industrial progress, and become this post-industrial society, which no longer produced terribly much of anything and made most of our money by speculating on currencies. And I'm afraid we're reaping the results of that right now. We have a very dangerous situation strategically. The COVID pandemic has exposed a lot of the weaknesses in what Lyndon LaRouche would call the physical economy of the United States. That is our food supply lines, our power supply lines, basic infrastructure. There are some areas where 1 or 2 bridges collapsing over the Mississippi River or someplace like that could completely disrupt trade in the United States. We had, I think it's either being or has been replaced, the famous Portal Bridge in New Jersey, where literally a man used to have to come out with a sledgehammer to put the bridge back together after a boat went through. It was 111 years old. And I thought they were exaggerating, but it turned out that that was the case. So the state of the infrastructure in the United States is a disaster. And this was not done to us by China or some other country. We did it to ourselves. And part of the purpose of my campaign is to get people to consider that we don't have to live the way we are living, that we can change our policies, we can change the way we think, and therefore transform our situation. Now, one of the things that happened at this so-called climate summit is that we had a speech by our Secretary of Defense. Now, people might not typically think that climate is an issue of national security or defense, but President Biden and Lloyd Austin seem to think that it is. And what Austin said at the summit is he said, today, no nation can find lasting security without addressing the climate crisis. We face all kinds of threats in our line of work, but few of them truly deserve to be called existential. The climate crisis does. Climate change is making the world more unsafe, and we need to act. And he goes on, the climate crisis is a profoundly destabilizing force for our world. As the Arctic melts, competition for resources and influence in the region increases. Closer to the equator, rising temperatures and more frequent and intense extreme weather events in Africa and Central America threaten millions with drought, hunger, and displacement, unquote. Now, I suppose, what does this mean? That prior to the Industrial Revolution, there were no hurricanes, no earthquakes, that 40 years ago when I was a child, before we had apparently so much destroyed the earth, the weather was always perfect, wasn't it? We never had a blizzard. We never had a flood. I mean, it's absurd. Nowadays, any weather event is called a climate crisis. Our planet is not that old. I guess it's about middle-aged. It's been around for maybe 5 billion years or so. I don't think there's any point in the history of this planet where the climate has not been changing. That's the nature of the development of the universe. Obviously, there are such things as pollution, and I think you may hear from some of our speakers about some of the problems of real damage to the environment and how we solve them. But it is not my view that the way you solve problems that are destructive to the environment is to eliminate human beings. Human beings are the only species which are creative, which actually can solve these problems by coming up with a higher order idea, a more efficient use of energy, like nuclear power, which uses extremely small amounts of fuel relative to burning wood or other things that are less efficient. Now, just also to situate this and the danger, as you may have heard, we have a really escalating situation of tension with Russia. It was useful that Biden extended the START treaty. That was good, but then he turned around and slapped these extreme sanctions on Russia for a series of crimes that there is no evidence that they committed, including the alleged hacking of our elections, which there's a lot of evidence that they did not do that. The so-called placing a bounty on the heads of American soldiers in Afghanistan, which turned out to be a total fraud. Nonetheless, it's there. The alleged attempt to poison Navalny, which it's hard to imagine that Putin, a former KGB leader, would be so incompetent that he couldn't figure out how to poison someone if he wanted to. And then they shipped the guy to Germany for medical treatment. I mean, every single thing is a lie, but sanctions are an act of war. And if you impose sanctions on nations which are already impoverished and war-torn, like Syria and Yemen, what you're talking about is the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Right now in Yemen, 400,000 children are threatened with death by starvation. And starvation is not something complicated to cure. So the idea in the United States that we are only, the way they're going to enforce this Green New Deal in terms of banking policy is the banks will only lend if farmers are willing to take land out of production, if industries are willing to shut down capacity. The only way you can get credit is, in effect, by limiting the possibilities for human existence. And this is extremely dangerous. And if you don't like war and instability, then you should not try and starve people to death, because what causes migration? Why would someone leave? Why would someone leave an area where they had grown up, where they had a culture, a language group, a religion? What would cause them to flee into the unknown? Well, if they can't exist, if they don't have food, if they don't have fuel, if they don't have access to basic security, then probably they're going to take a chance and try and go somewhere else. So this policy is very important. I think people haven't perhaps considered all of the ramifications. As you may know, part of what Biden proposed, he's talking about two things. One is this 30 by 30, which is to take 30% of our oceans out of productive use, 30% of our land out of productive use by 2030. Now he's saying he's going to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. And there are projects that are being proposed, like massive solar panel and wind turbine I'm not going to use the word farms anymore. One of our scientists said, please don't call them farms. They don't produce anything. So whatever you want to call, these gigantic areas of land and ocean are being proposed. Specifically, there's a huge area between Long Island and New Jersey being proposed for wind turbines. I was just reading about something called the Monster Solar Farm near Syracuse, New York, where they want to take something like 2,000 acres of farmland and trees, cut down all the trees and replace it with ugly, hot solar panels. These things are catastrophic. They're not going to deliver reliable energy, and they're actually going to harm the environment. So with that being said, let me turn it over to Bonnie Brady of the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate you also noting that, especially for our organization, which represents commercial fishermen, we are about public education and we do not take any political options. But thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. My name is Bonnie Brady. Our organization, the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association, represents commercial fishermen throughout Long Island in a variety of ports and a variety of gear types. I have been working on the offshore wind issue since about 2002 or 3, when LIPA wanted to put 200 megawatts of 2 megawatt turbines in the south shore of Long Island, just south of Babylon, in the middle of our squid grounds. That project was then killed 3 years later because the cost was 4 to 6 times more expensive than any other form at the time. And another project was attempted, I believe, around 2009 in an area that is now a wind energy area. And it was also killed for the same reason. I did bring some maps with me, or some pictures that we're going to attempt to do. I'm hoping that your fellows I put it together quickly. But I wanted to start with some images to kind of explain to people that don't have any idea as to what commercial fishermen are dealing with as it relates to offshore wind, what it means. And so visually, I'm hoping that I can help this to get along. So if we could go to the first image, which is image 7, please. Let's see if this works.
Okay, image 7. We're pulling it up now on Google
Great.
Slides. Give us
Thank
just
you.
a moment.
Sure. And we will see if it works.
There we go.
And any delays are completely and utterly my fault. I apologize in advance. Okay, perfect. This is a BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, map of the wind energy areas that are to be leased in the Atlantic Ocean at the moment. As you can see, what I have there to the right, the circled, that is the Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area, which is actually, as far as in size, for people to understand that, you can see underneath where it says Bay State Wind is Long Island, but the Rhode Island, Massachusetts wind energy area is actually 2/3 of the size of the Grand Canyon National Park. So I basically have talked about the energy island and steel forest that they plan on building there. It's also actually 3 square miles larger than Long Island itself, the entire landmass of Long Island. And the way they want it built out is to have basically a turbine every mile in any direction. They're starting as smaller groups, but the goal is to obviously build that area out completely. As you can see below that, there's also the other areas from the New York Bight, which were just recently discussed. And if you could go to image 15, please. These are the areas of the New York Bight that BOEM just recently announced. There's 800,000 new acres of areas that are within our exclusive economic zone. The Magnuson-Stevens Act in 1976 established a fisheries Bible, for lack of a better term, that has all the regulatory policy. It formed the fishery management councils, and it also pushed the foreign fleets off to from where they were basically right at our doorstep. It pushed them off 200 miles, and it gave commercial fishermen from the US, they wanted to build the domestic fisheries, so they created the exclusive economic zone of 3 to 200 miles. You can go to the next one, please, which I believe is 8. So what's the problem with the wind energy areas as exist? Well, for example, this is the wind energy areas of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and the New York Bight superimposed upon, I believe it's an OLEX or a wind plot system showing one commercial fishing boat and their transit and their tows in the area. As you can see, that yellow in the area that is not the orangey yellow underneath where those squares are, that's where guys fish. And this is only one boat. And you can see over that are purple because some of those were actually done. And that map represents about 8 years of fishing. You can go to the next map, please, number 9. I'm sorry, number 9. This is another picture that we have of another project that I just was made aware of that is in, not the Vineyard Wind area, that is in the middle of our squid grounds. It's just below it, south of it. It's an Equinor project. Equinor used to call themselves Stat Oil. It is a wind energy company that is 60% owned by the Norwegian government. And they're planning on dragging their cable, what I think is about 90 miles from that point all the way in through Manhattan. You can go to the next one, please, number 12. New England Fishery Management Council or the Mid-Atlantic, I forget which slide this is from, was talking about the risks for offshore wind development. And you can see the build out in the different companies. And then you can see Long Island, and you can see how Long Island is completely dwarfed by the size of all of these that they have in the works. They talk about that right whales may be displaced, that scientific data collection is going to be lost, and that the amount of revenue that we could lose individually and also as a variety of states, fisheries from Maine all the way to Virginia fish in these areas. You can go to the next one, please. So what's wrong with the Vineyard Wind Project? Well, this is a map from, I believe it's 2015 until 2019 that is on the New England Fisheries Science, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center site, where you can plug in the dates and you can find out where right whale sightings are. And if you see right south of Cape Cod there, you've got Martha's Vineyard to your left, and you can't even see Nantucket because of the amount of right whales that have been sighted in those last 4 years. You can go to the next, please. What else is wrong with wind? Well, if it's not sited properly, you can get this. 20 years ago, Ørsted built the Thanet wind farm off the coast of Thanet, England. They said it would take 8 months. It took 2.5 years. If the fishermen there had not at the time received a per diem during construction, they would not have been able to survive. In addition, they were able to force a contract by where the boats that were putting these in place were buying their fuel from them. The problem, however, is this photograph is taken from NASA, from space, and I can give you the links afterward. Those are sediment plumes because of the amount of tide. They are approximately 6 kilometers long, and they are between 300 and 500 feet wide, and they are 24/7. Ultimately, they've got scour of, I believe it's about 40 meters behind each turbine, and the cod are gone from the area. Next, please. Nope, that's actually not the one, but let's see. Maybe we can go to image 20 if you have it. There you go. Yes, thank you so much. They can even create their own microclimates so that they can have, in the size of them, they can actually have their own weather patterns. Next one is image 4, please. So what's this thing? You've all seen pictures of turbines. This is an electrical service platform. They carry about 70,000 gallons of oil, lubricants, greases, yaws, and they basically are a substation out on the water. In addition, because some of these systems, forgive me, I confuse it, but I believe that the cables are all in AC, and then they go through this system to be able to bring direct current onto shore. With the Vineyard Wind Project, they talked about having 4 of these. So between the 6, I think it's 84 turbines and 4 of these, they were, I think, somewhere around 250,000 gallons of lubrications, fluids, and oils that would be existing in that one wind project alone. The next slide, please. What's also wrong? Radar. We have issues because every turbine carries with it approximately, at least a 12 megawatt size carries about 3,000 pounds of rare earth minerals. So your option is you can get them from the toxic lake in China, or you can put children in the Democratic Republic of Congo under slavery in order to dig for them. Each turbine has 3,000 pounds, and when they spin, basically it's a magnet. It creates false targets and echoes. And on the left, you see what's just about bit of the block island, actually island itself. Above it is the 5 turbines. And on the other side is 5 ghost turbines. You can go to the next one, please. This is the Thanet wind farm from your radar. As you can tell, it's very, very difficult. The Thanet fishermen that go through there, they have much smaller boats. Maximum is about, I believe, 10 meters. And they only go in when they have to in daylight hours without any weather, because once you're in the wind farm, you cannot actually see other targets. They're masked by the false radar. Next, please. Here's another picture of the Block Island turbine. And in this picture, you've got actually 2 sets of ghost radar from the area. And that's only for 5 turbines that are only 5 megawatts in height. I'm sorry, 6 megawatts in height. They're about, I believe, between 500 and 600 feet tall. Next, please. Here's a boat from the Netherlands going through a similar wind farm configuration. As you can see, it's not just a dot, but it's actually this whole movement and area. So what a lot of Europeans have told us is you can see where the farm, and I apologize for that, where the industrial steel forest is going to be. However, when you're in it, you cannot see other targets. So as a result, in Europe also, in many of the areas, you're not even allowed to fish. They don't let you to go in there. Next, please. Here's that same boat looking at one of those wind farms at night. And as you can see, it's quite the sight. I call this picture the road to hell. Next, please. In addition to the fun filled from straight up radar, we also have ASR radar that's used by the FAA for flying. And as you can tell, based on these sites, this was part of a Department of Energy wind turbine radar interference mitigation webinar series they held last year. You can find it online. And the fellow from the FAA explains there's some seriously significant issues for the same reason. Many of the radar used for the FAA are line of sight. And because these turbines are going to be much taller than anything that they had even done any tests or studies on, you've got significantly impacted areas depending upon the size of the airport. On Long Island, it's Islip that's under the mark. In Nantucket, in addition to the whales, the planes are going to have issues, and so forth and so on. Next, please. You can actually go to this website and you can look at the PowerPoints for each of these areas. Some of them have video, but they refer to the fact that most of these systems that existed, the operational systems were between 1970 and 2003. And when you listen to the actual webinars, this one is not, I believe, on where they have a recorded YouTube, but they don't have a solution yet. So this whole issue, what we've been screaming about is ready, shoot, aim, affects far more than just the fisherman's ability to catch fish. It is the science behind it. It's what is it going to do when you pile drive and you jet plow and then you juice the ocean floor with EMF and then you create a hard substrate ecosystem where it was all sand shoal. Huge issues. Next slide, please. And it just refers to in this document talking about the issues. The Sandia National Laboratories and MIT have been working on this issue, and so far they have no solution. Next, please. And they talk about the offshore impacts, and you can find out more information by looking at some of those documents. The only one they refer to, the Block Island, is showing no discernible performance, but Providence, based upon the build out, is going to be significantly impacted. Next, please. Last but not least, why can't a trawler go through a wind farm? This is a picture of a net that they are pulling on the ocean floor. Those two little dots, you see the red boat on the outside, and you see the two, it's like a V. I refer to it as a sideways ice cream cone. There are two metal doors that are literally about the size of the door that when the boat is moving forward, they act on the ocean floor, an area of about 4 inches that barely touches the bottom, but acts as the spreader so that when the boat moves forward, the fisherman can basically herd the fish into the net. If in fact, however, that net gets hung up or the door or some part of the boat gets hung up on one of those exposed cables, because they're exposed all the time in Europe, they could flip the boat and die. Next, please. And as far as in the US, since 1976, we've been working to make all of our fisheries sustainable. And people talk about, oh no, overfishing. And you see obviously Seaspiracy, which went wild. However, in the US, we are the gold standard. Of 321 stocks that we know the overfishing status, only 7% are subject to overfishing. They're all on fishery management plans. For the 244 with overfish status, 19% overfished. Over 41 stocks of fish have been rebuilt since the 1990s. Next, please. And last but not least, offshore is not exactly a fun environment. This is a picture of my husband's old boat after he'd come in from a particularly cold winter when our harbor froze. And I know Bruce can say more about this. They're not even addressing any of these issues when ice throw happens, which they talk about on land, which is also another issue. Offshore is a little bit of a cruel environment. That's all I've got for now. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much. There's already one comment, but I'm going to take, and I have questions myself, but maybe we should go to Bruce and see what he wants to just say from the standpoint of the fishermen in the water.
Okay, my name is Bruce Beckwith. I'm an independent commercial fisherman from Montauk. Some of my concerns are probably shared by other fishermen, but I just like to say that fishermen aren't against clean energy. Well, we would like to keep our ocean, you know, as pristine as it is. I think that most of my concerns are legitimate. We're concerned about the negative impact the proposed wind turbines might have on our traditional fishing grounds. Are they going to destroy the seabed? Are they going to interfere with fish migrations, electromagnetic fields, AC or DC current? How one or the other will affect the fish? For years, mariners will now have a new danger when they're navigating the ocean. It used to be just fire, fog, and ice, but now we're going to have the windmills to deal with, which is just going to add to another level of stress. How far apart will these wind generators be spaced? Are we going to be able to fish in the same areas that the windmills are going to be placed? That's not a given. I mean, you know, politicians can say one thing and then change their mind, you know, on a whim. I'm concerned myself about being able to insure my vessel. Is this going to affect negatively how much my premiums are going to be, or if I'm even going to be able to get insurance on my boat now because of the extra danger of these wind platforms? Are we going to be compensated for any of our gear losses if we're fishing around these fish turbines? Fishing gear is very expensive, and it's not, you know, easy to replace. We're going to just be told right after these farms are, you know, turbines are built, are we just going to be told we can't fish in these areas anymore that, you know, we traditionally fished for years? As far as stress goes, this is just going to create another level of stress. I would say, especially for a lot of guys that work offshore for 3 or 4 or 5, 10 days at a time with maybe 3 or 4 crew members, fishing 24 hours a day around the clock, steaming home in bad weather, or even getting iced up like the boat we saw there, Dave's boat. Boats are mechanical systems break. electronic systems break. If you're in the middle of one of these wind farms and for some reason you lose your radar, not that it's going to do much good anyway, it could create a pretty dangerous situation. And especially like this area around New York where there's so much boat traffic, it's I could see that it you know, especially with these oil tankers and oil barges, all it's going to take is one really bad accident for one of these boats to lose power or be in a storm and ram into one of these structures and have the hull compromised. So it could affect the environment. I'd like to say that once these wind farms are put in place, how long is it going to take? Maybe 6 months, a year, or 2 years before we actually find out the negative effects on the fish migrations. Once these structures are put in place, I don't think they're going to take them out. They're going to be there until they rot or disintegrate. These windmills, I think, have a really good chance of affecting fishermen's ability to harvest seafood. And American people deserve to have fresh seafood, fresh protein from the ocean. And I just think there's a lot of variables and a lot of unanswered questions. I think there need to be more studies on fish migrations and how these electromagnetic fields affect the fish. One of the other things I'm concerned about is when the useful life of these turbines is done, is there any plan in place for them to be removed? Is there any money in place that's going to be able to, I mean, how are they going to be, you know, taken out of the ocean? Are just going to be left there to rot? I'm curious if my grandchildren are going to be able to carry on the fishing way of life. It's a concern for me. I just think that all American people deserve to have seafood, and I just don't think that this whole wind farm thing it shouldn't deter that in any way. That's basically all I have to say.
Thank you. You may have more when you hear some of the questions. So maybe we should go to Andy Olson, our farmer in Minnesota, who can tell us whether or not it makes more sense to put these gigantic arrays of windmills, solar panels on farmland, and also some of the financial aspects, as I was saying earlier, in terms of incentivizing people not to produce food. So Andy, if you're there, I had muted you, and so you have to hit *6 again to get on.
Okay, before I start talking about the Midwest, I would just like to make a comment after hearing your testimonies or your thoughts that this is all about genocide. These wind towers will definitely disturb the habitat of the fish, and it's going to be a loss of food, protein for people of the world, and especially America. And if you look at it as just harming this item or your other issues, the basic focus of this is to genocide, kill people. And you have to understand that. It's maybe hard to get your arms around it, but that's what it is. So wind towers on land sounds like a walk in the park compared to something out in the water. They'll, in about 10 or 20 years, maybe more like 15 years, a wind tower out here is worn out. So they either bring cranes in and lift out all the generators and blades and so forth, and they replace them, or they decommission the tower. And they had some landfills that were burying these blades that are sometimes 200 feet long, but the earlier ones weren't that long. Now they're getting to be huge. And the Sioux Falls landfill said, we don't want any more of this. We can't handle all this. So they ended up, they're hauling them way out to Wyoming, and they're burying them 20 feet in the ground. That's what they do with this stuff. And then they try to get a scrapper to come and scrap the steel tower. So it's everything. It's kind of comical what goes on, but this makes no sense if you think this isn't genocide. That's what it is. We started here in 1994. The major power utility in the upper Midwest was Northern States Power, and they had 2 nuclear plants, and they needed to reprocess that spent fuel. But what happened is that the environmentalists got involved, and they ended that. So we end up with this spent fuel, and they had to put it in casks and so forth and put it in water around these nuclear plants. So they needed authorization to do that, and the environmentalists were just stopping it. I think they wanted to stop the use of the nuclear power plants. So eventually it ended up that they struck a deal with the legislature that they would allow them to store the spent fuel in these casks, but the power company had to buy the power on wind towers on farmland outstate, away from the metro area of the Twin Cities. So they started this, and usually these wind fields are not near a transmission line, because the transmission lines always, traditionally in America, originate with a baseload power plant. So they didn't really have a pathway to get the electricity where the population was. So what they did for 10 years, Northern States Power, these towers were built by developers or whatever, and then they paid for power that wasn't even generated. They just, for 10 years. And that showed you the ridiculousness of this renewable energy. So there's all kinds of problems with these wind towers. They're a huge maintenance issue. And when you're out over water with, every once in a while out here, you'll see a tower that there's oil coming out of it around the blades and running down the tower. That's what's going to happen out there too. And it sounds like it's going to be a really intensive, labor intensive, and a lot of barge infrastructure to work with these towers that wear out and need a lot of maintenance, and in the ocean. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me. But it's challenging to try to work. Our towers are here up to the house up there where the generator is. It's 300 feet, and they don't have elevators in them, so they have a vocational school where they train these maintenance guys, and they want them to climb that ladder full gear in 3 minutes. So you got to be pretty fit and pretty young to do something like that. It's primitive. When this area out here was settled by the immigrants, each farm had a windmill, a small windmill that pumped their water, and that was before electricity. And everyone was so happy to get rid of these windmills when they got electricity. It was just like it was a new world. But now they're putting these primitive, no matter how big they are, they're primitive. They're they're not a baseload power plant that you can stand on the floor and you can maintain it and monitor it and fix it. You're out in the middle of the water. So I wanted to bring up something here, this unintended consequences of what happens with these renewables. And that I'm in the area where we have the Gulf Stream coming up against us, and to the northwest is the isotherm that comes up from Hawaii and the Pacific current, and it comes down from lower Alaska back into the Rocky Mountains into Montana and the Dakotas and so forth, and it kind of peters out at Winnipeg, Canada. Or you have the Arctic air that they call a polar vortex, that it's like Siberia coming over the North Pole and just pouring into the Midwest. And we had that last Valentine's Day in February, and then in 2019 we had it also. And what happens when you get winds over 32 miles an hour in this area anyway, they have to shut the wind towers down. Otherwise they run, it's like an engine running overrunning itself and destroying itself. So they have developed technology where they can hydraulically or with motors move the blades, the pitch of the blades, so they will stop. But before that, they use brake shoes, and there was asbestos all over inside. And these, if you don't maintain them, they wear out and they just sit there. So what happened this last winter is the polar vortex came over the North Pole and then poured down into the Midwest, and it made it all the way to Texas. And Texas had all kinds of problems, and it was basically because of renewable energy that they were dependent on. Plus, they had deregulated all their electrical controls. They didn't have regulation. So one of the entities in Houston, Texas is called CenterPoint Energy. And that is the major gas utility in Minnesota. Is 800,000 customers. And plus the former NSP is now called XL Energy, and they had customers. And so in 5 days, with the problems in Texas, it turned out that it's just surfacing that this information is that in 5 days they spent $800 million for gas, and we didn't run out of gas, but now the ratepayers are going to have to pay this. And the public utilities entity in Minnesota is they're just kind of shell-shocked, and you can't just say, well, we got to stop this. No, we need gas. And the real weakness of the whole thing is that renewables are replacing the baseload power plants, and to make up for that, they're retrofitting these plants or building new gas plants. Well, just what happened with the gas? I mean, what happens if you can't get the gas up here? The gas made it up here, or wherever it came from, we never know, because the pipelines are so involved in the under the ground all over the country. But this is insanity what we're doing. These renewables are unreliable. They're difficult to maintain, and they're primitive. We just, if we start destroying, and we've already destroyed one or taken one power plant. It was the first one of FDR of the Depression area up in North Dakota, they took it down and it's now a boat ramp in the Missouri River. So that's a little bit idea of what goes on out here, and I'll stop it there.
Great, thanks. I see Bob Baker has joined us, and I don't know how much he's had an opportunity to hear. Bob, did you get to hear the beginning part or see any of that?
No, unfortunately, and I really wanted to hear the presentations by the people before.
Okay. Well, what Bonnie went through and then Bruce elaborated is just the size and scale of where these wind turbines are going to go, which is massive. I mean, they literally dwarf Long Island. It's crazy. I thought she might want to say something about how these things are attached to the bottom of the ocean. In response to Andy, there were pictures, I think in Bloomberg News, of the old wind turbines. And these things, like solar panels, actually have those poisonous plastics. My good friend John Droz had me watch the film about the DuPont case where they were burying all these barrels of toxins that don't break down. Solar panels have this in them, and there isn't a way to safely dispose of them right now. You also can't produce solar panels without very intense heat because they're largely made of aluminum. So it's absurd to call it renewable because you can't renew it. You cannot make solar panels based on a solar panel economy. The wind turbines, I saw these horrible pictures of these giant, turbines, these pillars just in the ground, like you said, under 20 feet of dirt. They're plastic. If you see films on the production of these things, they say you shouldn't touch them because they have really finely crushed glass and other things in them. So you're just putting this in the ground. I mean, it really is a fraud. And one other concept I wanted to mention and then open it up for discussion and share a comment. LaRouche has two terms that have to do with how you measure economic success. Neither one of them has anything to do with money. One is called potential relative population density, which is how many human beings can be sustained in a given area of land. And it's natural for that to increase, and even for that to increase geometrically because of scientific discoveries. If you think about burning wood, which is terribly inefficient, or you go back to before we figured out how to burn wood or use fire to cook our food. I don't know who invented that, but I'm sure glad they did. If you're just eating raw insects and whatever you can grab or catch, you need a huge area of land to sustain a family, right? Because you're just foraging, grabbing what you can. Chances are you'll eat a poison berry and drop dead. So life expectancy is low. The energy throughput on the land is low. And then someone makes a discovery, fire. You can burn wood. Suddenly you have a means of keeping warm in the winter. You have a means of cooking the food, of killing things that might poison you. Life is improved, but burning wood is still very inefficient. You need large amounts of wood. The more you try to do, the more wood you're going to use up. And so again, if we remained at that level, you probably wouldn't have more than, 500 million, a billion people on the planet. Coal was much more efficient than wood, petroleum more efficient than coal. What this means is that you're using a far smaller amount of whatever your raw material is to produce a much greater amount of energy. I think you can think of it, if you think about the blade of a knife, why does a knife work? Well, if I took the side of my hand, and I'm not a karate expert, so I'm not going to have a whole lot of speed, but suppose I just took the side of my hand and I said, I'm just going to slowly cut this apple. Well, chances, it would not go through the apple. My hand is not going to go through that apple. If I took a knife, which was able to convert the energy of my hand into this very narrow point, where you're concentrating much more energy in a very tiny area. That's an increase of energy flux density, the amount of energy that goes through that area. And suddenly, with the same amount of pressure on a knife, I can slice right through that apple. So energy flux density is a key, if not the key factor in determining whether you can sustain the population density that you have. And there's a very real aspect of this we're experiencing today, and why LaRouche was able to forecast in the 70s the rise of pandemic disease, is he said, if you get to a certain level of population density, of people you can sustain, suppose take Manhattan, very, very densely populated, you depend on electricity. Suppose you suddenly get rid of electricity for a place where people are living on top of each other in Manhattan. Well, now what you've done is you've lowered the carrying capacity. Those people can't live piled on top of each other without electricity, without food brought in from somewhere. So what happens is when you lower the potential to sustain your population, you get disease, you get extreme stress, you get starvation. And what you get is a hyperbolic increase in the death rate. So when you talk about going from forms of energy which are highly concentrated to forms of energy, it's like going backwards, where you say, we're going to get rid of the knife and you're going to go back to trying to cut the apple with your hand. So instead of having a power plant which takes up an area that's smaller, maybe you need the space of a couple football fields, to say we're going to cover an area the size of the state of Texas, and we're going to have less energy, and we're going to have all this stuff that we can't dispose of. You're actually condemning your population. You're going to create an increase in the death rate. And people have been terribly taken in by this. And I'll just read one of the comments that came in on Facebook, and then I'll let people share your thoughts and also elaborate on what's been said. But Ben writes, at the rate we are using up resources without concerns of byproduct waste, we will not only poison our future generations, we will poison ourselves. There is absolutely no good reason not to use green energy. There are plenty of reasons to reduce fossil fuels and other highly toxic energy like nuclear energy. I say no to these crazy ideas of polluting outside our tiny world until we can learn to be more resourceful and concerned about energy sources and the poison byproducts. The fracking is completely done with neglect and irresponsible, greedy corporations who do not care about anything else but profit. This is madness fueled by selfish greed. And I will say there's certainly a legitimate reason not to trust big corporations, because a lot of them have demonstrated that all they care about is profit. But this is a little different. So I'm going to stop, and maybe Bonnie, if you have anything, and also if you could tell us something about how these windmills are attached to the ocean floor. I'm really interested to know that. And I guess they have cables or something underneath as well.
It depends really as to which area. On the ones that they have planned for the Atlantic, for the most part, because it's in up to, I think, about 120 feet of water, they are planning on pile driving. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with what a pile driving thing is, I was just looking it up while you were chatting. We're talking about pile driving monopiles approximately 120 feet down into the ocean floor using a 3,000 or a 4,000 kilojoule pile driving hammer that's got a width of about 30 feet. According to the one document that I just looked at for the South Fork Wind Farm project, which is planning on using, I believe they want to use 9 megawatt or maybe 10 megawatt turbines. That means 4,500 strikes per 24 hours and up to 8,000 strikes per 24 hours. Now, this is in an area where the right whale is. So you literally can hear this for 50 kilometers away. If you go to our Facebook page, Long Island Commercial Fishing Association, scroll down, you can find it. There's articles that we've put about a lot of the science. This is the problem. It's supposedly being done for science and because of our knowledge. However, we are ready, shoot, aim. You don't pile drive the ocean floor, which in addition to the sound levels, so that if you're a right whale or a minke whale, anything that hears in low frequencies, and you're right close when they start, they talk about, well, they start slow so that any animal probably runs from the area, but God forbid you don't, they can wind up destroying your eardrums and or killing you within that hot zone. And fish that have a swim bladder aren't going to be swimming at all if they happen to be right in the strike zone to begin with. And those fish that don't have swim bladders, something like squid, which all animals then eat and we catch, which becomes calamari, they can wind up with lesions, because in addition to the sound profile, there's particle motion pressure. And it's kind of like, for those that are familiar with an explosion, there's concussive waves of power. So as this giant hammer is slamming this piece of metal into the ocean floor, there are concentric waves of pressure and the particles also in the sand that are just radiating outward. So any animals that are in that area, not a good day for you. Then after they do that, then once they get them all in and they put them together, then they jet plow the ocean floor. What does that mean? That's a hydraulic jet 6 to 8 feet through the ocean floor in an area that they say the workout area is approximately 20 feet wide. I don't believe the cables are approximately this big. That's for 135,000 kilovolt cable. But the idea is that the area that they're working, they take this giant, what looks like a giant snowplow, the kind that has a V. They do a pre-lay grapnel run first, so anything in its way gets shoved off to the side within about 60 feet of a corridor, and then they jet plow the ocean floor and they lay the cable as they move along the site. Now, supposedly the sand just goes back magically and all is well. You know, that's essential fish habitat, that's sand shoal environment. We've got species that live through all their life cycles in that area. And apparently that's okay. And so then we have the EMF, the electromagnetic frequency from the cables, where they tell us they're going to go for a target of 4 to 6 feet. If they can't, however, or if there's a reef in the way, because they're not going to go expensive and do horizontal directional drilling if need be on the ocean floor, which if they did, they could really sink these low, but they refuse to do so because it costs money. And the gentleman who spoke regarding corporations, these are foreign government owned transnational corporations. There's an article in, oh gosh, what is it? I forget, Applied to Ecology, that just came out last month about the Oceans 100, the 100 transnational corporations shipping the big money that's basically ocean grabbing from the other stakeholders in the ocean because there's money to be made. And if anyone thinks for a second that they're doing this out of some altruistic reason, I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. So the EMF, what Bruce had talked about, there's been studies already that show that certain species are attracted and certain species are repelled. Elasmobranchs, sharks and skates really like it. Why? Because they use electricity to sense, I think it's, Bruce, you might help me out, the teleost, but it's the electrical signals that are sent off in order to catch prey. Things like lobsters don't like it at all. They may cross over a cable, but they try to get out of the way or burrow. We haven't even done any studies to prove what's going on. The studies in Europe have been somewhat stunted because when you're the foreign government who's starting the foreign government owned energy company, this is the best part, in Denmark, Danish fisheries law, you're not allowed to go into them. And they basically, if you're a fisherman in Denmark, they pay from the time the survey begins, so no one loses gear. They go in for the survey, they pay the guys that would normally fish there to not fish there. They pay compensation for construction, and they keep them closed most likely. So they wind up actually paying them long-term for their area that they've lost, because that area, once it's gone, you can't go back to it. But in this country, when I brought up the fact that they compensate their own fishermen, I was basically told, well, but we don't have that law in the US. Trawlers risk dying. What Bruce said, I've been in hundreds of meetings in the last 20 years. You lose your power, you get rope in your wheel, you've got fog, your engine dies, you lose your radar, you've got 20-foot seas, you get a rogue wave, you've got, storm conditions that come up out of nowhere. they say to us, well, you can fish there. Everyone knows the second somebody hits something, insurance is going to make it, what Bruce talked about, so ridiculous. We're not even going to go near there. But meanwhile, 50 years ago, we created the fisheries, Magnuson-Stevens fisheries law to remove the foreign fleet off of our shores. So our domestic fisheries, because we are seafood production, we feed people. And now 50 years later, the foreign companies are coming back in. They're taking our ocean floor from us, and our own government's letting it happen. That's a real issue.
Yeah. Bob, do you have any thoughts?
Well, that's very interesting for a guy that came from the Iowa flatlands who didn't get exposed to a lot of ocean water, but that's the nature of what's shifting clear across the country and the world, and that's the Green New Deal dynamic. And we saw it yesterday with President Biden's climate seminars that he had, and institutional leader after institutional leader started to talk and really put the narrative out that we've got to have these policies to save the country. But I like to discuss it in terms of man-made global warming is simply a Trojan horse for the lords and the ladies. And the lords and the ladies used to run the feudal farms, and they kept a lot of people in serfdom and as peasants who had tremendous skills of production, but they never got anywhere because the lords and the ladies controlled the system. And we fought a revolution to get rid of that. And all of a sudden, the so-called peasants became the people that the financial system by law was to serve. And that's how we got privately owned family farms and businesses, and built industry across the nation, built the railroads with the backing and the kind of laws that you could put in place with the American system of economics. Now, let's put this Green New Deal system into perspective. First, what does it mean to never be in the same place? When you get up from your breakfast table and you go to work and you come back home in the evening and you sit down in the same chair at the same table, you're not in the same place. And we live in a world that's rotating 1,000 miles per hour. One Earth rotates in the solar system, and it moves about 67,000 miles per hour in our solar system. And our solar system rotates through our galaxy at about 514,000 miles an hour. And our galaxy, the Milky Way, propels through the universe, which is made up of 2 trillion other galaxies, according to the Hubble telescope observations. Yet our galaxy travels at an astounding 1.3 million miles an hour. And it's hard to be in the same place twice. Now, the size of intergalactic cosmic wind and electrical forces that blow through the universe and hit our planetary solar system with cosmic radiation and activate our sun to explode solar flares that bombard the Earth, this all makes man-made global warming look like a speck of sand on the beach. So the magnitude of these solar dynamics really put the idea of the Green New Deal into perspective. What's really going on? I mean, one needs to think about the tricks of the lords and ladies in our modern times. How do you end up becoming multi-billionaires in a relatively short time? This is the modern day lords and ladies. And our founding fathers, they understood these tricks very well, as LaRouche did, and as the policy he formulated. And they were designed to set humanity free from the control of this kind of process and break the chains of serfdom-like systems of financial control over hardworking people who wanted freedom to build and experience the joy of their own creativity and families. And our new nation provided the political structure to unleash privately owned family farms, factories. We built cities along the railroads. We established a parity-oriented economy in which the financial institutions were the servants to the people and the physical production. And it worked, and it still works, but it's being suffocated by this 21st century form of lords and ladies. So I like to bring that kind of a perspective into it, just to point out the absurdity of how this whole concept of global warming is being cooked up so that they just stampede like a tsunami of narratives through the media. So that's all anybody's really talking about, but it's really a camouflage so they can use the idea of saving the planet from global warming by reducing the carbon. And the way they're going to do that is set up a carbon market. So they can, the lords and ladies can buy and sell the carbon and put it into a speculative frenzy that helps reduce the population of the world by constricting the use of farmland and food production under that kind of a system. So I'll just let it go, but I wanted to sort of explain that a little bit in terms of to put in perspective what I think is this man-made global warming is a Trojan horse that they're moving into the middle of societies and countries all over the world. And then out of that's going to come the camouflage that everyone is going to be stampeded. They've got to change the laws like right now, immediately. Except they just don't understand the concept that you're never in the same place twice.
You know, your comments, Bob, just reminded me of also one of the things that the military national security, people have all heard this, climate refugees. Well, everyone's moving because of climate change. The fact that we've been bombing countries like Iraq for 30 years somehow has nothing to do with why there's a bunch of refugees, or that we, you know, funded and armed ISIS in Syria and they were chopping everyone's heads off. No, it's a climate crisis. Or that Gaddafi was murdered in Libya and that country thrown into total chaos. We're supposed to believe that somehow these are all climate refugees. Or what we've done in South America with the creation and funding and protection by Wall Street of the drug cartels, so that people in Mexico or Ecuador or Colombia cannot, their children are not safe. They're being killed and held for ransom by drug cartels, which are protected by our financial system. And so you have refugees, right? It's really absurd. Now, a question, someone's asking, I think they're referring to the particular project off Long Island. How many windmills are supposed to be there at what cost, and what peak power is this allegedly going to produce?
Well, they've carved out several areas. I mean, initially, if you go back 10 years as to what the initial owners that were Deepwater Wind wanted to put in the area, they talked about 2,000 megawatts of power throughout, which would be, let's see, in today's thing, about, 100 different turbines going through that area. But right now, the South Fork Wind Farm is 15 windmills. It was supposed to be 90 initially, but in 2016, I want to say, they came to LIPA and said, we want to do a 200 megawatt project, and the cost was too much, and so LIPA turned them down. Then they went with LIPA put out a request for proposals for a renewable energy project of 90 megawatts, and lo and behold, shockingly, Deepwater Wind was the one who won that bid. So you've got that coming in. That project is specifically in Cox's Ledge, which is considered a cod nursery ground. And then they're bringing I want to say it's a 56-mile long cable from Cox's Ledge south and then west and to land in Wainscott. I noticed someone had asked in the chat room, if it's okay, I can answer that. As
Go
far
ahead.
as Elizabeth asked about the enormous subsidies, and enormous they are. First of all, who are the transnational corporations? Here we go, gang. So we've got Ørsted, which used to be called Danish Oil and Natural Gas. Ørsted was a Danish oil, and Ørsted was owned, actually, I don't know, I take that back. Dong Energy was originally oil and natural gas. And in 2013, Goldman Sachs got an 18% stake in ownership in the business, which they relinquished in 2018. I believe in 2018 or so, Dong removed all of its oil and natural gas. They sold that all out, and they rebranded themselves as Ørsted and went into the renewable market. Denmark, wind-related items are 8.5% of Denmark's GDP. So Ørsted basically, and most of the other European companies, what started is giant subsidies in the EU in the 2000s. So they went there because there's where the subsidies were. And from there, they were building out, you've got Statoil, which is now called Equinor, which is 60% owned by the Norwegian government. For the one project in the New York Bight that is being done, they have partnered with BP, and they've also partnered with BP in a project that I showed, one of those things that was going in through the sound. Ørsted has found PSE&G as a partner, or I believe National Grid in some, and maybe Eversource in Connecticut. Basically, often what they're doing is they're partnering with a transmission company. You've got Shell, which is multinational. They have a piece of the Massachusetts wind energy area. And who am I forgetting? I know I'm forgetting someone, but basically you've got the major players in the market right now are Ørsted. So you've got Denmark, you've got Norway. And the thing that's interesting, the one for Vineyard Wind is called Copenhagen. This is great. I love this. Copenhagen Investment Partnership or Infrastructure Partnership. Copenhagen Infrastructure Partnership was originally created through a funding by Pension Denmark that is one of the labor pension funds of the country of Denmark. So what they do is the money that is taken from the labor market, let's just make the assumption that some of that labor market is wind related, goes into this fund. They bid on the property, on the wind farm. They win the project. They then use, because when people talk about the jobs, the jobs that are going to be done here in this country are coming from over there. They have all of the equipment. They use jack-up barges. They're getting around the Jones Act, and they're going to be bringing all the stuff this way. Why? The turbines in Europe, they transport them standing up. We don't have the infrastructure. I was at a National Bar Association meeting about 4 years ago in which they were discussing offshore wind. And the guy who came up with the Port of New Bedford for wind said, we're not going to have the same kind of market as we have in Europe. Esbjerg used to be Denmark's largest commercial fishing port, over 2,000 boats. They're down to 12. And it is now the place for offshore wind. thousands of acres with these things. They come over standing up. They meet a jack-up barge, which because it never actually goes to port is considered a point. They bring them there and then they pile drive individually from that area. So they never actually come to port. The companies that use them, either foreign flagged boats, either they're from Denmark or they're nationals that are living there paying in pension funds. So they come, they bid on it, they win it, they use their own employees that then when they get the paycheck, they get their part taken out. It goes back to pension Denmark, which then winds up helping, they do it. In Orsted, they do it too, and they call it farm downing. Farm down. And what they do is once they buy it, then they sell pieces of it to various other, usually pension funds. Why? They've been getting probably close to a 20% return on investment for about the last 20 years until the subsidies dried up. Now they're out looking for new subsidies. Why? Because with an 8.5% GDP, you've got to keep feeding the beast. It's a shell game, and Americans are not aware of what's happening. I mean, I have, and I know the gentleman, Mr. Olson, I've got to meet so many interesting people that are fighting onshore wind for the reasons that, I mean, on the Atlantic, it's not just the fishermen, it's not just the fish. We've got the right whales, we've got the harbor porpoises. Oh, and we've got the Atlantic flyway, where most of the migratory species of birds, in addition to flying close to land, they fly about 10 to 20 miles offshore. And that goes all the way up and down the coast. These things take out, people are like, oh, well, but windmills, they take, more cats kill birds, not raptors. Raptors are the ones both on land and on the water that are taken out because they hunt at night. And bats the same thing, because they work based on sonar and they get attracted to these things. They get too close. And because the speed of these blades is about 175 miles an hour, even though it looks really slow, but because of the size of these things, when they go close to it, their little lungs explode. It's just, it's everything it shouldn't be. And we're not going to study it. We're just going to put it up there because we're being told we have to hurry. But at what point you don't, I've said this repeatedly, you don't destroy the environment to save it. If we're not going to do our due diligence and make sure that haven't we learned these lessons on land? Why are we going to I sometimes feel, and this is my own personal belief, Americans want quick fixes. There is no quick fix to this. And they want to go to the next shiny thing. We can't do it on land because there's too many conflicts between land and neighborhoods. They don't want them there. They don't want to lose their property value or have their areas destroyed or not be able to sleep because of the infrasound. So they putting in place in different states laws so that their own home ruled communities can't vote against these things. So where are we going to put them? Let's just dump them in the ocean. Why would you set your farm fields on fire? What they're doing here is destroying a food source. And during COVID, we all learned how important your food source is. We had millions of pounds of fish in New York that we could have caught and brought to the people, but we had no way to get them to the people. It's a bad deal. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, as far as in the subsidies, they were getting 25% on the cost of a construction. So if it's I'm making this up. So if it's a $2 billion project, help me out there. What's 25% of $500 million? They get back. Plus there are renewable energy credits that different states are putting as sort of a carbon swap, what you were talking about, in order to force the subsidies at the state level for these projects and have other power sources, base loads like gas or nuclear, pay for these quote unquote renewables. And so they're getting it on both sides. And plus what I've been told, and I'm not a Wall Street type, I have a journalism degree, is that they are creating a derivative on the stock market based upon using the renewable energy credits and the subsidies, and that's being sold. And I know for the Block Island project, they used Credit Suisse and Paribas and Citibank as the main things. The hedge funders are into this game and they're not into it to lose. And I would really hope that anyone, if they want, they can go for us to Long Island Commercial Fishing Association on Facebook page. We have tons of scientific documents. We don't believe that in any case or form an industry that's been around for 400 years providing food for Americans should be pushed off to the side so that foreign government-owned energy companies can make money on our grounds.
Thank you. We're really short on time, so I just would ask all of you, and Andy, I muted you again, so unmute yourself if you want to. If anyone has anything that they would like to say in closing in terms of what you want people to do, thoughts you have, anything.
I'll say something.
Yeah.
Something I don't understand, especially on the East Coast in the summertime, we don't have much wind, and it's when we have the highest demand for electricity. And the other thing I like to say is if they do succeed in putting all these wind turbines in from Eastern Massachusetts to Delaware, especially in the summer, it's going to be a nightmare with the amount of boat traffic that there is in the summertime. The U.S. Coast Guard is going to be overwhelmed. So
Can I ask something or mention something really quick? People aren't aware when they say it's a 100 megawatt project, that's nameplate. That's not how much energy they produce. On average, wind farms are 38% of what the nameplate is. So if they say it's 100 megawatts annually, it only represents 38%. The Block Island wind farm this past summer, all last summer, 26% of the capacity. So they are not doing what they say. And what Bruce is talking about is extremely important because they're not going to achieve the goals, and they require gas 24/7, not only for backup, but to modulate the grid so that when they get the power surge of energy, that they can use the gas just like you do on your stove to be able to equal it so that you have full equilibrium.
Right. I'm really glad you said that because I was going to bring up this point that for wind and solar, and here's the dog now, you have to, he's very upset about this because he likes electricity. But you need 24/7, and you have different patterns in usage. And things that depend on the weather, which we do not control, cannot give you that. And it is a big deal. Americans take for granted, and I think we should be able to, because so much of what we do depends on reliable energy at the flick of a switch. If you get rid of that, that upends everything. And that is, so whatever you're building in wind, you have to build an equal amount in gas. So you're not getting rid of CO2 production.
Plus you have all those hundreds of thousands of tons of steel, the fiberglass, those blades are fiberglass, so they cannot be recycled. That's it. Rare earth minerals, oils. Yeah, it's not exactly. I refer to it as the emperor's new clothes salesman. Yeah. If it sounds too good to be true, chances are it is.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Anything else?
I appreciate being able to give my opinion.
Andy? Was that you, Andy? Or Bruce?
Yeah.
Andy. Okay, go ahead, Andy.
Well, it's the same out here. The wind towers, the wind only blows 25% of the time, even though we consider ourselves windy, and it sounds like the same thing for you folks along the East Coast, that the wind only blows about 30% or 28% of the time. And so it's just absurd. This does not make any logical sense, this renewable energy. That's why I call them unreliable wind towers, because that's what they are. And yet they're shoving this down our throats. And you have to ask yourself, what is the reason for this? And the only thing that really describes what's happening is that this is population reduction. This is going to reduce the food supply. This is going to affect livelihood of all kinds of people that we don't even understand. So we have to defeat this one way or another, and I'm very appreciative of what the LaRouche organization has been doing and has done, and what Mr. LaRouche has done for 50 years. if it wouldn't have been for these people, we probably would have been taken over a long time ago. So I appreciate the struggles and the challenges that you folks are dealing with. We've got the same things out here, only we have cartels. We have grain cartels. We have meat cartels. It's, you know, they're the people that control the food. So
Yep.
I've enjoyed the discussion.
Great, thanks. Bonnie
Thank you.
seems to have some other things she wants to raise. Go ahead. Bonnie, you're muted.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention a huge issue in the Mid-Atlantic is something called the Mid-Atlantic Cold Pool. It's this blue glob of cold water that basically seems to offer some protection toward any type of climate change that's existed in other areas. There's two really big concerns. Like my biggest absolute fear factor thought is they're going to put these things out in 14 miles. When you line up turbines in a row, you have something called wind blockage. DNVGL talked about it a year and a half ago. Ørsted lost 8% of their stock after they did it. Basically, when you line them up, each turbine that's behind it, the first one takes wind from the next one, from the next one. So they don't produce as much. They've been overestimating how much energy they produce. But what happens as a result is putting these right out in the 14 to 20 mile mark, where basically the ocean's upwelling and downwelling occurs. How does that happen? The ocean winds help to cool the currents. And that's where you've got basically the primordial goo that is mixing, that creates phytoplankton, which all the animals, everybody's eating copepods and then fish eating fish, etc. So we put these things out here, we steal enough wind from the area so you can't maintain the ocean and you can't maintain the productivity of the ocean. We're going to destroy our food supply. And there's modelers out there that could look at this, and everyone's kind of pretending, oh, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. Meanwhile, what's going to happen? The same thing. Thousands of these turbines stealing wind from each other means you're not going to have those ocean breezes. What does that mean in the summertime? That means you're going to turn on your electricity and put up your air conditioning even more, which works great for the utility companies. It's mind-boggling, the lack of science that is being done from an administration that believes in science. It costs $640 million in order for NOAA NIMS to be able to get this information on the ground, redo these scientific surveys that determine fish populations, everything else, ecosystem changes, you name it, and they still haven't been funded. Yeah.
Thanks. I think we have to wrap up. So I just want to really thank everyone. Thank you for joining me in this discussion. Again, for people who got on late, Bonnie said it explicitly. She's speaking for educational purposes and not to endorse my campaign by herself or her association. But I have to say that for myself and my campaign, I do intend to do something about this. I think something has to be done before I get into the Senate, though. So everyone who is watching should circulate this material. Go to the website for the Long Island Commercial Fishing Association or the Facebook page. Help get this material around. The presentation here was very clear with the graphics and so on. And I'll say tomorrow at 2 o'clock, the LaRouche organization at laroucheorganization.com is having a discussion on sort of the report back, what happened at these 2 days of summits. And some of it was actually interesting because a number of leaders said, as opposed to the idea of the climate change, China in its way, India in its way, Russia said, you have to consider the question of poverty. You have to consider the right of people to have economic development. You can't make up a one-size-fits-all program. Putin made a point that methane is far more dangerous than carbon dioxide. So there's not conformity, there's not uniformity. There actually is, I think, reason to be optimistic that we can defeat this policy, but we have to think from the standpoint of global strategy at this point. Just as we can't defeat the pandemic by fighting it in one country, We're not going to defeat this policy in one country. It's a global policy by a group of global multinational corporations. So tune in tomorrow at 2. Next Friday, we will not be having the symposium at 7:30. I'm going to be the guest on the John O'Loughlin radio show at 8 o'clock. So I'll be posting the link for that so people can get it. And then please put May 8th on your calendar. There's a major international Schiller conference on the urgent need for a new paradigm for Western civilization. So once again, thank you, Bruce Beckwith,
Thank you.
Bonnie Brady, Andy Olson, Bob Baker, and we'll see you soon and be in touch.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.